Hello, everyone. Welcome again from the Petersen Automotive Museum. We're here talking with one of the leading automotive designers of the day, Henrik Fisker. Henrik's work has been with BMW, Aston Martin, and a host of other areas. And for the past little while, he's been doing his own work out of what is now Fisker Inc. So welcome, Henrik.
Thank you very much.
So how did you make the choice to be an automotive designer? How'd you get into the field?
Well, since I was a kid, I've always been drawing cars. And sometime when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, and kind of everybody else stopped drawing cars and attended to their homework, I kept drawing cars. And all my notebooks were just full of cars. And eventually, my dad said, you should really think about becoming a car designer. So when I went into my counselor, I was probably about 14 years old. And they asked you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I want to be a car designer. And they said, there's nothing called a car designer. You can become an architect. And I said, well, I really want to be a car designer. They said, well, there's nothing called that. So I started reading car magazines. And eventually, Art Center College of Design in Pasadena came up. And I actually attended they had a branch in Switzerland. So that was the closest for me because at the time I lived in Denmark and Scandinavia. So I jumped in my old rusty Alfa Romeo. It was an Alfa Romeo Alfa Süd that was never sold here in the US. It was a tiny little Alfa Romeo. And I remember I had a 1.2-liter boxer engine with 68 horsepower. And I had super large 15-inch wheels on it. Anyway, I jumped into that, drove down to Art Center College of Design in Switzerland, and I was accepted. And I started there in 1986.
Wonderful. Were there certain inspirations you had, particular designers you admired their work, particular cars that you loved seeing?
Yeah, I mean, my big inspiration at the time was, of course, Giorgio Giugiaro. He had made so many amazing show cars. I remember the Maserati Boomerang was just one. I remember walking by a magazine shop and seeing the front page of that car. It just looked like a spaceship. I think at those times back in the 70s, and there was probably a much bigger difference between show cars and the cars you drove every day. It seems like that's sort of, disappeared a bit. At that time, it was really futuristic, flying, UFOs, etc. So that was one of my inspirations, of course, Pininfarina. So I would say really the Italian designers were my inspiration. But actually, I loved the American muscle cars, but they weren't usually attributed to a certain designer. So, I loved the Pontiac Firebird, all of them in the 70s, even the one that was driven by Burt Reynolds and, late 70s, like with the big chicken on the hood. I thought it was so cool. So
Trans Am, yes.
Yeah, it was just a cool car. It was just amazing that a normal person could buy a car like that. So I had a lot of different inspirations, but obviously the Italian car designers at that time were sort of leading.
Which many people would argue with us, they never gave up that lead. So it's an ongoing conversation. So let's say there's someone else out there, a young student, maybe just getting ready to graduate high school, and they're watching this and they're seeing your work and everything else, and they decide they want to be the next Henrik Fisker. They want to be a great car designer as well. What types of training and skills do you encourage them to go out and pursue?
Well, I think that it's a very tough competitive field out there, and the days I think are over where you get a chance. And even when I started, it was already starting to get over where you could get a chance to get in and become a car designer unless you had a formal education. So I think going to one of the recognized car design schools in the world. I mean, here in the U.S., you got two of the most noteworthy here one here in California, Art Center College of Design. That's the one I graduated from. You, of course, got Center of Creative Studies in Detroit. You got another one in San Francisco. You got a couple in Europe, that I've been working with as well a long time ago. Royal College of Art in England. So you got a few. There's not many. I would say there's probably only maybe a handful that truly are recognized. So it's really about trying to get into one of those, work on your portfolio, submit it, and trying to get into one of these schools. I think is very important because car design is very complicated. You have to work together with engineers to actually make your design work. is not just about making a drawing, it's about understanding how a vehicle actually functions, how it's put together, about all the safety regulations, bumper restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, you need to understand all that to create a really excellent car design.
Yeah, you make an interesting point. We always share the story because it's a Los Angeles story of Harley Earl, who had started as a young kid just helping his dad, who was a coach builder at the day. And that was enough to get the attention of GM, and the Harley Earl career began. So is it truly just the technological development, cars have become more complex, that is driving this need for formal education?
Well, I think that the formal education have just expanded to the point where it's just required because there is that education available. And what it does for the automakers, it kind of takes a lot of time out of getting somebody up to speed and truly contributing to the company. So when you hire somebody, let's say from Arch and the College of Design, that person gets thrown onto a real program almost from day one. I think there's maybe 6 months of getting up to speed, if that, and then you're immediately starting working on either parts of the car, maybe proposals for entire vehicles. So it's, in one hand, I think, exciting that you can quickly get in and be part of it. On the other hand, I also think is necessary because I don't think in this fast-paced environment we're living in that you can afford to have somebody sort of spend several years learning the craft of car design. That's what car companies want you to do on your time at a recognized school.
Okay, that all makes sense. So obviously formal education important. Are there other things a prospective designer should be doing just to build out their skill set? I always like to think about artists who are told to walk around with a sketchbook, and if you see something interesting, you sketch it out and all that, because that helps build the skills. What should a prospective car designer should be doing?
Well, I think one thing that's important, and I really see the difference when I look at people's portfolio. I think people that, or anybody who wants to become a car designer and really successful in it, does have to understand, the story, the history of cars, and going to the Petersen Museum is excellent for that, obviously. The point is that there is many different reasons why a car looks the way it does, and there's also a very interesting history of cars and how they evolved. And there are certain things throughout the history of cars which kind of have stayed with the automobile. And there are certain things that I think people gravitate towards when it comes to form and sculpture and proportion. And it's very important, I think, you understand what an attractive proportion is versus an unattractive proportion. I think that's very important. And sometimes I see some of the younger designers haven't spent too much time truly understanding that. The reason that's important is because certain designs can work really well on a specific proportion. And then there's other designs, if you try to take a initial sketch and put this design on a proportion that doesn't work for that design, then the design ends up not working. I mean, an extreme would be if you're sitting sketching a two-seater low coupe and suddenly, you're getting assigned to design the next minivan. And now you go, I think I'm going to use that design, apply that to the minivan. It's obviously not going to work because the proportion is completely different. That's obviously the extreme. But I think to understand automotive proportions, what works, what doesn't, is very important. I think it's very, very important to understand three-dimensional shapes. And I don't know that there's a real specific process of how to learn about that. Part of what you learn in design school is you learn to sketch in 3 dimension, and then later you learn to take that 3-dimensional sketch and idea into real 3 dimension by making maybe a little clay model, for instance, or you go on a computer and you make an alias model. But to truly understand 3 dimension, I think is very valuable to go back and look at some of the most beautiful cars in history. Why were they beautiful? What was it about those 3-dimensional shapes that came together and worked? I would say a car might be the most complex product that exists. If you truly walk around a car and understand all these surfaces has to come together And on top of these services, you have to integrate features which are safety features which are required, like headlamps and tail lamps. And they often sit on the corners of these vehicles where all the surfaces come together. And they are obviously also three-dimensional, so you also have to think about that. So I think you can learn a lot by simply spending a lot of time looking at vehicles. And unfortunately, it's not enough to look at the vehicles of today, because one of the things of today's vehicles is they are very restricted by our rules and regulations, whereas the older cars were not. So what a lot of times we try to do in car design, we try to get out of that restrictive box. And I think it helps sometimes to look at some of those early vehicles, sort of from the 50s and 60s. Those are the ones I really like looking at. It was sort of, for me, the golden era of car design where there was very few restrictions and a lot of creativity. And people just built it. There wasn't much talk about whether this was really the right design or it really functions. They just built it. So I think that's the exciting part of looking at these designs. It doesn't mean that you need to do retro designs. It doesn't mean that you take anything literally from those vehicles, but I think you can learn a lot from looking at them. And again, going to a museum, going to a Concours event, that you've got to see it in reality, by the way. You've got to get up close. You've got to touch it if you're allowed to, but you definitely have to get very up close and really looking at those three-dimensional forms.
Well, as someone who works in a car museum, I certainly appreciate your attention to history, since those are the type of stories that we're here to tell. What I'm kind of gleaning from this is that even though the marketers and the advertisers are always talking about the next revolutionary design, you're kind of giving me the idea that a lot of car design is more evolutionary, that we have ideas that we've worked out and we're learning how to build on those, integrating new technologies, integrating new regulations. Am I about on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that, like I mentioned, I think the 60s were really an amazing, creative, explorative era. I think now I actually feel there's a little bit of a comeback in car design, and I expect that there will be a really big comeback in the next sort of 5 years. And what I mean by that is that I think we're going to start exploring more with different proportions and definitely a lot more sculpture in the vehicles. We have seen sort of a very sedate area of the last, I think, 20 years, where everybody was more focused on just getting sort of the maximum, interior space, and then all the side section had to be within 20 millimeter, whatever it might be, and therefore it restricted somewhat the designer to do a lot of exciting stuff. So we have ended up with a lot of creases in the cars, which is sort of substituted real unique sculpture. So what you today see is all these creases, which is sort of a little crease that you create in the car, almost like you're folding your pants and you see that folding line. And that's what you kind of see today in a lot of cars, actually. And the reason for that is because there wasn't enough volume to create exciting sculpture. I think we might see some of that coming back. I think we might see some new proportions. And the reason is also partly we're going into electrification. So electrification allows you to do more sculpture in certain areas, for instance, on the front end of the car, specifically on the hood, because you don't have to clear a large gasoline engine anymore. And the new proportions may also happen because of electrification, because again, you don't have the traditional components like an engine in the front and a gas tank in the rear. Today, those electric motors are sort of going right down between the wheels. And then you have a battery pack usually on the floor of the vehicle. So that starts changing the proportions of at least certain vehicles. So I think we're going to start to see a revolution coming. But we also mustn't forget that a lot of people, for them, specifically, we're talking about affordable vehicles, that's their most expensive purchase ever. And they do need to think about resale value because it's a big, investment they're making. So therefore, a lot of people who's buying affordable cars are not always willing to buy something that's extremely different because sometimes those vehicles can go out of fashion. We have seen some lately. I don't need to mention any names, but we saw some very boxy, funky Japanese vehicles coming out that was really cool when they came out. And now, you probably can't get rid of them if you gave them away for free. So, that's some of the issues that that you have when you're trying to appeal to the mass market. But I do foresee somewhat of a more dramatic change that we have seen in the last 20 years.